And lastly, here, as we take a look at the 18th century colonies in an overall sense, economic, demographic, social, religious, cultural trends, we now look at the most important intellectual trend and happening of the 18th century, the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment started in Europe, roughly spanning the 18th century, but of course crossed the Atlantic, since the colonists we're talking about here are English, British colonists, Europeans, and so the Enlightenment had a huge impact here as well. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that the Enlightenment, kind of like the Great Awakening and evangelical religion, only much more so, has a huge influence on our society and culture right now. That you can see on the screen before you some of the most important Enlightenment values, but I would argue that these are the core or foundation of our value system right here, right now, in our own culture and society in the 21st century. So if you've never heard of the Enlightenment before, and most people haven't, it's an interesting question and a good one to ask, why haven't you heard of it, if I'm right in saying that it is still the kind of fundamental core of our value system to this day. I'm not proposing to answer that for you right now, but it's interesting and I think important food for thought. We're not talking about enlightenment in the Eastern religion, Eastern spirituality sense. This is a specific enlightenment of the 18th century in Europe. And this was an intellectual movement that spanned the century. And I guess we need to define what an intellectual movement is to have any idea of what the Enlightenment is about in general, but before getting into more specific items on our list here. So to keep the definition broad, I like broad working definitions for teaching purposes. So I will say that the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement, the Enlightenment being one, is a constellation, a set of ideas that come together at any given time and place. A lot of new ideas, sometimes mixed with some old ideas, and that if and when those ideas together reach a critical mass so that they end up turning over and changing the way that society thinks and by extension behaves, because when thinking and values and beliefs change, it tends to change the actions as well, then it's an intellectual movement because it's ideas that have changed the way a whole society does things, and so the society itself is transformed fundamentally. So just to give us another example, by this definition, the Renaissance would also be an intellectual movement. Constellation of new ideas mixed with some old, reaches a critical mass, changes the way a society thinks and the way a society behaves and the way a society does things. Okay, so the Enlightenment of roughly the 18th century, a European movement to begin with, but spread eventually to the colonies and really around the globe from there, is still much of the modern value system to this day, was really begun in France, and some of its most famous writers and most influential intellectuals were Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu. But the Enlightenment had major thinkers in Great Britain and Italy and Germany as well. And we should realize that the Enlightenment is made up of thinkers, intellectuals, writers. All of them had that in common. And among other values, I'm simplifying the list here, but at the top of the list comes progress. Progress means the belief that things are going to get better, that the world can be made better, should be made better, that we are or should be moving forward. The Enlightenment thinkers in Europe and their colonial counterparts, and Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and others qualify as Enlightenment intellectuals on their own right. They contributed to the Enlightenment, but the idea of progress was fundamental. The belief that with the proper set and collection of ideas, some of which you see below on this same screen, that the world could be made better and needed to be made better. The Enlightenment thinkers were not so naive to think that this was a done deal, that it was for sure, but they believed they had the right recipe of values and ideas, and that if they were put into practice, that the world would be likely to be made at least moderately better, if not more so. So there was a fundamental belief that the world could and should, that human society could and should be made better. Secondly, the Enlightenment thinkers were all greatly enamored of the scientific thinkers of the previous century, the scientific thinkers of the scientific revolution, famous people like Sir Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon. And the Enlightenment, frankly, was quite interested in science, and there were plenty of European scientists of brilliance who carried on the work of their forebears from the previous century. However, the Enlightenment itself, though interested in science and quite conversant in science, was primarily interested in scientific method, at least more so than science itself. And what the Enlightenment thinkers were trying to do was to take scientific method, and the method means the way in which scientific thinkers went about their business, the way Isaac Newton formulated his laws of gravity and his laws of motion and his theory of gravity. So the techniques by which thinking was done effectively, the method, the combination of inductive and deductive reasoning, the use of mathematics along with experiment, the use of hypothesis, all of these things, methodical, really kind of algorithms of sorts that the Enlightenment thinkers realized were of critical importance in the scientific discoveries and laws that had been found and discovered in the previous century. But what the Enlightenment wanted to do was take scientific method and take its aim away from the physical world, which is what Newton and Bacon and others were doing, trying to understand the physical world, and they wanted to sort of take scientific method and aim it elsewhere. They wanted to aim it at the human and social world. They thought by using the same method, the same techniques of thought and thinking, the same experimental philosophy and method, that they could then unlock the secrets of human society, human psychology, human institutions, human beings, in the way that Newton and others had unlocked the secrets, at least many of the secrets and laws of the physical world. They were greatly enamored not just of method, but of the importance of human reason, the ability to think rationally. And they then were extremely optimistic about critical use of reason. What this means is that, and I'll use a crude analogy here, not crude, but simple analogy here. It's as if the Enlightenment thinkers were saying that Europe needs to go through its garage of ideas and values and institutions and traditions and hold all of them up to a critical test of reason and usefulness. You see the word or the phrase useful knowledge below there. So it's like, I said garage because here's my cheap analogy. Our garages, my garage, for instance, can kind of sometimes get overflowing with junk. We let things accumulate, pile up, things that we don't need, and we have to go out and at some point and clean up the garage. So I go out on a Saturday to throw things out, to clean up, straighten up my garage so I can fit my car in there for the first time in a month. So mine's never been quite that bad, but close. So let's say I go out and first thing I pick up is an old shoe. And I haven't worn the shoe in months, partly because I don't even have the second matching shoe. So I realize immediately there's no rational point in keeping that. There's no usefulness to that shoe. So that goes in the garbage. That gets thrown out. Let's say the second thing I pick up is a hand saw, a saw that you can use in the backyard, that I use in the backyard from time to time. But it's old. The blade is rusty, the handle is loose, but it still works. I still use it from time to time, and so until I get a new one that's better, it doesn't make sense to throw it out. So this does pass the test of reason and usefulness, so that I keep. So it's as if the thinkers of the Enlightenment, first in Europe, then in the colonies, and around the world from there, are saying what we need to do is go through our garage of ideas and institutions and traditions and values and customs and hold them all up to this critical test of reason and usefulness. And if it doesn't pass, if one or another item doesn't pass, then we either reform it, change it, or completely throw it out. If it passes, we can put it back on the shelf and continue to use it. But they believed in doing this unstintingly, without fear. And you can see that this would likely and did bring them controversy. Not everybody in Europe was wild about some of their proposals for change. For instance, for sure, the Enlightenment was going to hold up the institution of nobility. Families that got certain legal privileges that others didn't, simply because of their family name, simply because of the family they were born into. That's not going to hold up to the critical test of reason or usefulness. I guess we should add another word here. Along with reason and usefulness, they believed justice was important. If it wasn't reasonable, if it wasn't useful, it wasn't just. And so they believed that then holding nobility as an institution up to the critical test of reason, usefulness, and justice, that it's just not just for somebody to get special privileges written into the law just because they were lucky enough to be born in a certain family and somebody else wasn't. But of course the nobility, which was rich and powerful, wasn't going to like hearing that. So the Enlightenment was controversial because these thinkers, these writers, these intellectuals were stirring the pot. Useful knowledge, our third item here. Do we mean then, as opposed to useless knowledge? Well, in a sense. They wanted to focus primarily, not completely, but primarily on the most useful kind of knowledge, because remember, their project, their Enlightenment goal of to make progress, to make the world a better place, really it came down to knowledge that helped to improve standard of living, improved economic conditions, improved the overall way of life for human beings. And so by useful knowledge, not 100%, but mostly what they were referring to was technology. They wanted brain power and genius and brilliant intellectuals and scientists to use that brain power, use that learning, use that genius to improve technology, because that would help the world and society to make progress. The Enlightenment also was way ahead of its time in seeing the importance of institutions in any society. Institutions like the family, I mentioned nobility, that one they're critical of, but bigger institutions like an economic system, government, educational institutions. And they're also holding those up to the critical test of reason and usefulness, and saying that if they don't pass, they need to be reformed, or maybe even thrown out and sort of started over. I say they were ahead of their time because I think even today, especially in our own American society, we have a tendency to downplay the importance that institutions play in our lives. Americans are taught, not incorrectly, that everything is about the individual, or that most things are about the individual. And so we tend to then not, I think, understand as well as we should how much institutions affect us as individuals. Not always for the good. I'm not saying good or bad. It's both. But they do have a profound influence on all of us as individuals. And the Enlightenment seemed to recognize that ahead of its time, and maybe even more than most people in our country do today. So they wanted to reform economic, religious, political institutions, government, and hold all those things up to the critical test of reason as well. To show you how ahead of the time they were in this regard, most of the social sciences really were born in the 18th century Enlightenment. If you, say, take a basic survey course in sociology, the textbook, the professor will likely tell you that though they didn't call it sociology yet, that sociology was really born of the Enlightenment, in the Enlightenment. It was typically an Enlightenment sort of based subject. Remember, the Enlightenment thinkers are trying to use scientific method, using scientific techniques, scientific ways of thinking to understand human society and human beings better. Sociology is a subject one subject among many that tries to do that. The last two items on our screen here I will put together as one and then separate them, but freedom and happiness. And the 18th century word for freedom was liberty for the most part. And where do we see those two words, liberty and happiness, in the exact same sentence, a famous sentence? We see them, of course, in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, it's not an accident that it has Enlightenment ideas and Enlightenment words in it, because Thomas Jefferson was a creature of the 18th century. He was Enlightenment educated. He'd read all of the current and earlier Enlightenment European intellectuals like Voltaire. So he was very conversant in Enlightenment ideas. He was an Enlightenment intellectual himself. So the Declaration of Independence is an Enlightenment document from top to bottom. And so much so that the Declaration isn't particularly unique. It's not full of original ideas. Thomas Jefferson was a brilliant writer, and in later units we'll see he was brilliant in many other ways, a brilliant political leader. But the Declaration of Independence is not really an original document. Other American leaders at the time that read it would have just looked at life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, because yeah, we've heard that before. All men are created equal. Yeah, we've heard that before. Not that they would disagree, but they would just kind of go past it because they already understand, already agree. It's already very familiar to them. So the Enlightenment was committed to freedom kind of across the board. All of the civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom to peaceably assemble, all those things they sort of stood for, were champions of. Particularly freedom of speech and freedom of the press, because remember, these guys are trying to change the world through their ideas, and their ideas come in the form of books and published writings. And so they need the freedom to publish and the freedom to write and say and think what they want, if they want their ideas to spread enough for them to change the world in a progressive, progress-oriented direction. They also believed, the Enlightenment thinkers, in economic freedom. They were the biggest supporters in the 18th century of what today we call capitalism. It wasn't called capitalism yet then, but it already existed. And they believed then that individuals needed to be, for the society to improve, to progress, for institutions to reform, for things to function well and better in any society, economic institutions needed to be free, and that individuals needed to be free to move about. You can't really have capitalism effectively if businessmen, merchants can't move, go where they need to go. That free exchange of ideas. Without information, capitalism doesn't work. If it can't move from place to place and people aren't free to acquire it, it doesn't work either. So freedoms across the board, they believed in. Happiness. Are we saying that happiness was invented, born in the 18th century? Certainly not. And the Enlightenment thinkers didn't believe so either. But happiness doesn't really show up as a blip on the radar screen of consciousness until the 18th century, meaning it doesn't show up in like the primary source documents, the meat and potatoes of historical study. Historians, most of the evidence that they garner and gather to understand the past and to know what happened at all comes from primary source documents. And the word happiness, translations from the French and German and Italian and Spanish, happiness, English, it doesn't start showing up in the documents until the 18th century. And then it starts showing up kind of all over the place. And so this means that happiness wasn't really a value. Right? We're talking about Enlightenment values. So that doesn't mean nobody was ever happy before the 18th century. That would be absurd. But it's saying that it wasn't really a goal. It wasn't a value. And this, I think, also shows that happiness doesn't show up as a value in a goal until standard of living, economic conditions, and maybe lifespan, and just overall quality of life is improved enough so you have enough time and kind of leisure to think about your own happiness and how to achieve happiness. To give another simple example, if you're out in the wilderness, lost on your own, and you're not, you don't have camping gear, you don't have a tent, you don't have a warm jacket, you don't have the basic gear, and you're not good at that kind of thing, you're not a survivalist, and you sort of lost the group that you're with, it's nighttime is, coming, it's getting colder and colder, you don't know what to do, you're frightened, you're looking around for hours, can't find anybody. That's not the moment when you'd sit down on the nearby rock and say, you know what, I'm going to sit here and think about, contemplate my happiness. What do I want to do with my life? What do I want to do to make myself happy? You're not going to use that time and that moment to think about happiness. Why? Because you're in sheer survival mode. You're thinking about, how the hell am I going to get through this night? How am I going to get out of this place alive? And that's how most Europeans and most people in the world had to think before the 18th century. If you go back to, say, the Middle Ages, let's pick Germany, a German peasant, poor farmer in the 13th century, in the Middle Ages. It's right at the height of the Middle Ages. This person did not have happiness as a goal because he was in survival mode all the time. So each winter, he's just thinking about how he's going to get himself and his wife and kids alive and well through that cold winter into the next harvest season, and then pray that the weather goes well, that the crop is good, so that he brings in a successful harvest the next season, and so on and so on and so on. That doesn't mean he's never happy. Maybe the day that his first child was born, he was ecstatically happy. Maybe at the end of a work week, he and other farmers go to the village pub and on a Friday night and sort of tip back a number of ales and get drunk and tell jokes, and they're happy on those nights. So life is punctuated with moments of happiness, but it's not a value, it's not a goal. And so this becomes important in the 18th century for the reasons mentioned, and it then becomes sort of linked together, I think you can see, with the idea of progress, with critical use of reason, with useful knowledge, improved technology, reformed, better, rationalized institutions, all the important uses of freedom, and happiness then is sort of enmeshed with those. I picked just one of our founding fathers here as an example of an Enlightenment intellectual. We've already mentioned him today, but Thomas Jefferson. But we could pick any of the big name founders. Alexander Hamilton was extremely well educated and read many of the Enlightenment thinkers of Europe and was an Enlightenment intellectual himself. And Benjamin Franklin, also, who we talked about earlier in the lecture in one of the other segments, is also an Enlightenment intellectual as well. So Franklin and Jefferson, both extremely interested in science, interested in all kinds of things. Both of them believed in the idea of progress. Both of them understood the importance of institutions and were trying to improve them all the time. Both of them believed in human happiness and human freedom and liberty. So they're both great exemplars of the Enlightenment in America. One final point to make, which is a somewhat ironic one, the Enlightenment was born in Europe, as I said before, but the place where it was the easiest, not that it was easy, but easier, to take the ideas and put them into practice, which means put them into law, make them policy so they can actually be acted upon and become part of, the real life society. It was easier to do in the colonies and the early United States than it was to do in Europe. And there's a number of reasons for it, but I'll just focus on one simple one here. In Europe, most of the Enlightenment intellectuals, thinkers, and writers were just that, intellectuals. And so it was kind of a two-step process necessary to take the Enlightenment program, assuming that it would improve and make the world better if put into practice. The two-step process required then the intellectuals to write about what was necessary to change, but then they had to convince the politicians, the kings, the parliaments, the elected legislatures who made the decision to pass the laws, who made public policy, to enact them into law, to put them into practice. Well, it was a bit different in the American colonies / early United States because for the most part, and I'm simplifying a bit, but for the most part, the same guys that were the gifted intellectuals and writers were also the most powerful politicians, including this guy right here on the screen, Thomas Jefferson, but the same with John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and on down the list. So whereas in Europe it was a two-step process, the intellectuals had to convince the politicians, which made it harder, not impossible. In America, it was just the same guys convincing themselves because they were the intellectuals and the political leaders at one and the same time. So actually, you can see in the U.S. Constitution, for instance, a great example of Enlightenment ideas in the Enlightenment going from idea right to practical purposes, to the creation of institutions, in this case political and legal institutions. Thank you.